Hello and welcome as we come now to the 32nd weekend of the year. And we're looking at the readings that are given us for that occasion. The first reading comes from the second book of Maccabees, chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 9 through 14. The second reading comes from the second letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verses 16 to chapter 3, through to verses 5. And finally, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 20, verses 27 through 38. All right, so as we are following the story of Luke, as he is presenting his Gospel, and clearly we have seen now that Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. The material that is missing from last time, which is from chapter 19, we went 1 through 10 last time. Now we're going to pick up, we're skipping, verses 11 through 27. And maybe quickly to look at what is being reviewed here or left out. Partially, as I've mentioned before, because some of this material is also found in Matthew and Mark, and therefore in the course of the regular readings we don't listen to the same section. But what is happening here is that Jesus, as we mentioned, is on the way to Jerusalem, but he has now entered Jerusalem. And that reading, as entrance into the city of Jerusalem, of course, is remembered on Palm Sunday or Passion Sunday. And we find Jesus coming into the city. And as he enters the city, here are some things that are pointed out in verses 28 through 48 of chapter 19. As Jesus has entered, he is greeted. He then begins to explain either to his audience or to his disciples who are following him that the city of Jerusalem is destined for a fall. In fact, Jesus gives a little background as to how the city of Jerusalem will fall. Of course, remember that this gospel is written in hindsight. The event has already happened, but Jesus is pictured as describing how it will fall. Ramparts will be set up. Again, it's similar to the descriptions that are given in the other two synoptic traditions. Jesus now comes to the temple, and in the temple is the story of the overturning of the money changer's table. Now, in Matthew and Luke, it gets very descriptive, Matthew and Mark rather, but Luke is a bit more genteel here, simply argues when he overturns tables, but that's about all he does. There's no picture of whips and things like that, but makes the case that my house is to be a house of prayer, and therefore it is, from the point of view of Jesus, not really happening. Now in verses 20, chapter 20, verses 1 through 19, questions arise as to the authority of Jesus. Where does he get this authority to be doing the things that he is doing? So his critics, of course, ask that. And as Jesus is wont to do, doesn't really give a straight answer in this regard. But he is now pictured, and this is where we pick up the story, he is now pictured as teaching in the temple area. And he begins by giving a parable. This is a parable about a man who has a vineyard and sends servants and other representatives to collect his store of the produce, rather, that is due him, and he doesn't. And so all of this, we won't go into this because this one is also well known. I keep mentioning that. But kills, however, the son of the owner, and therefore that is the metaphor often seen as reflecting on what they will do to Jesus. So now he is pictured being in the temple area teaching. And he is going to be approached by those who are seeking to find a way to place Jesus in a bad light with regard to the audience. Now keep in mind that present in the temple at this time would have been a number of folks, both from Israel itself and maybe even those who had come up to Jerusalem for the celebration of the Passover, which is the setting now in which these encounters with Jesus take place. And so the first test is the test of this is generally presented by the scribes and chief priests. The different groups are kind of challenging Jesus with regard to the question of the tax. And so this is the instance of the coin question, whose image is on it. You remember we have seen this a number of times as, well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give to God what belongs to God. We're never quite sure what is the amount that is supposed to be given to Caesar. This is what I said, that sometimes Jesus begs the question, but he does make the distinction. The second test, and this is the one, or challenge, that we're looking at this week. So finally, we come to chapter 20, verses 27 through 38. And this time the challenge is presented by the Sadducees. The Sadducees present an interesting case. They tell the story that a man marries a woman, he dies. The woman now becomes the wife of one of his relatives. They die, and it goes through the fact, you'll hear this, that 7 different men have the same woman as a wife. And then as that all happens, finally, as the 7th guy dies, the story says, and the woman also died. Now the question is posed to Jesus by his critics, whose wife will she be in the new world, in the new heaven? Because she was married to 7 different men. So it looks like, kind of a riddle in a certain way, and almost a little bit nonsensical. Who could marry 7 times? This has to do, we have not noticed this before, has to do with the question of what are known as Levirate marriages. Levirate, Levirate. This is found in the book of Deuteronomy, known as the Law of Moses, which was set up, this whole issue. Basically, you remember what the issue is, that if a man dies without heir, that is, without a male offspring, it is the responsibility of some member of the family to take the dead man's widow as his wife, and that any offspring that come from that relationship become the heir of the deceased man. So that's basically the idea behind the Levirate law. What it sought to do was to guarantee the continuity of a family. And since the name and treasures of a family were male passed on, you can see why it was important to have a son when one died, so that he would carry on the family tradition. So now the issue, as we mentioned, if a man dies without an heir and his wife is widowed without a son, what should happen? The ideal partner here, by the way, in this situation, would be a first cousin. And as I mentioned, then the heir would carry on the tradition. We, of course, might not very much approve of this in our own time. And in fact, it's generally believed that the so-called Levirate law wasn't practiced even in the time of Jesus, but it had been practiced earlier on. And of course, it was connected with, perhaps we may have mentioned this, most important, memorable story. It goes back to one of the sons of Judah, namely that Judah has a son, marries a woman named Tamar. He dies. The process of carrying out the law happens when the elder son of Judah, who is Onan, is called to enter into this marriage with Tamar, the widow, but he doesn't. In fact, spills his seed and is struck dead. Now, that, of course, often was misinterpreted. We have mentioned this, but the true reason there is he has denied the family for his brother, and that's, of course, a shocking way to remind one not to do this. Judah has one more son, which he delays in making sure that the law is carried out, so much so that, and then Judah loses his own wife, and he is sorrowful about that. So what happens, I think we mentioned the story, but just to quickly tell it because it's a classic tale. Finally, Tamar, the widow, realizing that her father-in-law is maybe not going to carry out what he should be doing, knows the habit of her father-in-law, who kind of drowns his sorrow a little bit in, spirits. And after he does that, sometimes even, anyway, she plans one time when he's coming home from having a night out, kind of sets herself up to be greeting her father-in-law. He invites her into his tent, and they have relationships. Now, this could have been a dangerous thing for Tamar, but Tamar, before they had entered into this, had said, I need a little remembrance of this night. Could you give me what we would call today your underwear, your undergarment? And he does. And a short time later, after this event, Tamar announces to Judah that she is pregnant. He is ready to have her killed because he doesn't know how she could dare do this. She sends him the little remains that she had gathered. He realizes that he is the father, and a son is born, and the line of the family is carried on. So that's the Tamar story. That's the Levirate law. There is a certain critique of this custom because certainly males, all right, the male line is carried on, but women are really just kind of used as objects almost, and the custom has a lot to speak against it. The only thing that may have made it kind of tolerable for women is that a widow, if she had no male heir to support her, could find herself in a difficult position. And so this gave a certain guarantee to a woman of a place to stay and of a future. Well, that may be a justification from some point of view, but you can see that women interpreters of the scripture today, even of this story, are a little more critical of this whole process here. Be that as it may, that's the challenge that the Sadducees, and you will remember we have mentioned the Sadducees before, were of the priestly caste. They were rather well-to-do. They tended to live in the Jerusalem area, and they distinguished themselves from other Jewish groups by the fact that they did not believe in the resurrection. The Pharisee group did, and there were other groups who also believed in a resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not. Why? Because they said the only thing that they believed in was the information that would be found in the Torah, in the scripture, in the first 5 books, and they would argue that, and did argue, that nowhere in the Torah is there any mention of a resurrection. So therefore, since it wasn't in the written word, they didn't believe it, and they didn't think that, well, that anyone else should. So that was the distinctive characteristic that set them aside from many other Jews of the time. Now, Jesus responds. So, see, they have presented a really kind of ridiculous situation. 7, of course, 7 is the number that is often used. It's the popular number here. But 7 men all dying without producing an heir. But you can see, they do it in such a way that when they pose it the question to Jesus, they think they kind of have trapped him. Remember, this is their idea, is to find some way to put Jesus in an unfavorable light. So whose wife will she be since she married all 7? That's the question. The response that Jesus gives, and very often when his critics are being hypocritical, Jesus, in effect, almost replies to his opponents with an insult. And here's how it works. So we'll hear this and notice this. First, Jesus explains the facts of life and reproduction. If he has to tell men who are grown up how things work, there's you can kind of see it a little bit insulting. Immortals, and this of course is what is pointed out, don't need to reproduce. Only humans have to reproduce. So, says Jesus, in the kingdom, it's not going to be like it is here. And so there is no need for this. And you should know this, says Jesus to his Sadducee critics. Then his next response is a double-barreled in a certain way. He tells Sadducees that those whom God considers worthy of the age to come and worthy of the resurrection are immortal like angels. Obviously, few Sadducees did not believe in angels or spirits, so therefore, you see, he's quoting the very text that they are using in their objection to what Jesus is saying. He throws it back to them. The spirits are angels. Well, now there's a whole discussion there about angels, but the Sadducees did find angels there, and so they should have put this together. And secondly, he identifies these immortals as children of God and describes God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, obviously, if God in Moses' time is the God of Moses, and he's the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then there is a kind of immortality here that goes on, that Sadducees seem to miss. This is the crowning insult, because when he quotes the Torah, the law, to the Sadducees, they are the ones who pay attention to this. And so, what have you missed? Don't you notice, okay? The patriarchs actually were long deceased by Moses' time. Only a living can have a God. So God claims to be the God of the patriarchs. Therefore, there's this kind of subtle suggestion of resurrection that lies behind it. So, you see how Jesus has now responded to the Sadducees. They maybe were sorry that they even raised this issue with regard to Jesus, because the children of Moses, of the patriarchs, are immortals, therefore they live, and therefore there is some continuance of life, and thus is a teaching with regard to resurrection. All right, so all of that has to do with the question of the Levirate law, the fact that Jesus kind of bunks it or debunks it is important to notice. The allusion, and this will take us to the first reading from the second book of Maccabees. Now, as you know, in the Catholic tradition of the collection of the Bible, there are two books of Maccabees, a first, second, and a second. And in fact, there are, seems to have been a very popular event to have remembered, there are 4 books of Maccabees. There's a second and the third and fourth book of Maccabees, which are not included in our collection, but are included in other collections of books that belong to the Old Testament. The event that is described in the book, in the writings of the Maccabees, is an event which took place between the year 180 and 161 before the Common Time. As you well know, I don't know how much of a background here one understands about the Maccabee books. The Maccabean rebellion, of course, is well known. Even in Jesus' time, it was well known. Took place when a man named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was a successor to the territory that had been achieved by Alexander the Great. When Alexander had died, he had divided his material up between 4 of his generals, and the one that we're looking at here, Antiochus, had conducted a war against, now keep in mind the time frame here, really the middle of the 2nd century, a war against the armies of Egypt, had been successful there, had come back now to Palestine, and wanted to Hellenize the territories that he ruled. Now, Hellenization, and there were some Jews who accepted it, had its advantages, but Hellenization meant that there were certain customs or practices that they practiced. Among them, they were famous for building their gymnasiums. There was a gymnasium built by Antiochus in Jerusalem. A number of Jewish men had joined it. One of the things that went on in the gymnasium is that the men were, of course, wore their natural suit. That is, they didn't wear any clothes. And because the mark of circumcision was there, some of the Jewish men tried to hide it so that it wouldn't stand out with the other men who were engaged in that regard. What Antiochus now asked is that the Israelites follow Hellenic cultures. As I say, part of it was acceptable, but part of it is that they were not allowed to not eat certain foods. Remember that there were foods that were set aside by Jewish law, which said that men should not be able to eat. The Antiochus wanted to make sure that men did do that, and so there was a rebellion led by a man named Judas Maccabeus, his father Matthias. The whole story of the rebellion is told in Book 1 of the Maccabees. Book 2 of the Maccabees is a little different because it offers resistance stories, and that's where we're going here. That there are two famous resistance stories that take place in the Maccabee book. One has to do with the death of a man named Eleazar. Eleazar has a manly death. They want him, he's very along in years, they want him to break the custom to eat the food. After all, what's so bad about that? But he resists to the point of death, saying, I want to leave to the young and noble examples of how to die willingly and generously for the revered and holy laws. So he is the first hero in the Maccabee book. The one that we're listening to today has to do with the martyrdom of 7 sons. Notice there's the 7 again, who are all encouraged by their mother, don't do what they want you to do. Resist even to the point of death. So this unnamed mother encourages them to remain faithful and not to betray the customs. Now, when the second son, and of course there's a kind of order here, the second son, as he is being tortured, says these words, God will raise us up. The third son, when he is tortured, adds, we will rise with an integral body despite the mutilation that those who are killing us will do. And the fourth son, as he is dying, says, the wicked will not have a share in the resurrection. So it's those 3 sayings of 2, 3, and the second, third, and fourth sons that are connected with the idea of resurrection. See, and now you can, as we saw, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. So here are young men willing to die for their beliefs because they believe that life will continue, or that there will be a resurrection. So we stretch it a little bit to get this one little section from Second Maccabee as kind of a support for the thinking that goes on in the gospel passage that we heard. You might, if you've never read the books of Maccabees, they are certainly, the feast of Hanukkah is connected, as you know. Judas Maccabeus leads a rebellion that turned out to be successful, overthrew the forces of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Say his name very quickly 3 times, see how that works. And by throwing out, because what he had done is put right in the middle of the temple a banner to one of the gods of the Greeks. So that, of course, was called the abomination of abominations. Maccabean rebellion was successful. There is a story when we come to the Hanukkah time about what happened there. But loyalty to the customs and to the practices, even to the point of death, would be admired by many. So it's with that in mind that we this time find Jesus challenged by the Sadducees, reminded that the resurrection was a part of the thinking of Jesus' time, and hopefully that might be an encouragement to them. We believe in the resurrection. We know that this, of course, is the great gift of God to his Son and is shared with us as now we hear the word of God this weekend. Glad to be with you. Hope to see you again.